Try it now. Hey, there we go. Thank you, guys. Okay. All right, last week we were talking in chapter 17 about God's man and Satan's city, and there's a little bit more of that to do in chapter 17, and then we're going to look at a little bit about chapter 18 in the book of Acts. So that's where we're going to be tonight. We talked about the fact that Paul wound up in Athens and how it was such a city of high education, sophisticated people, art, drama, math, all that kind of stuff. It was the golden academic area of the world at that time. And so when we were looking at the scripture, we looked at the fact that Paul had entered the city by himself. He didn't have anybody with him. He has been beaten up multiple times. He's had to travel quite a ways to get there. Most theologians believe that Paul was at a very low point at this point in his life because he was by himself. But as he goes through the city, he sees the altar to the unknown God, or the idol of the unknown God. It says people of Athens. And he goes to this place, a court, that took their name from a spot, but they don't meet in that spot anymore. But they're called the Areopagus, and it's the court. And he goes to that court and he says, people of Athens, because they called him to come there and let them know what he was saying, because that was part of their job, was to make sure that he wasn't teaching anything that was contrary to the Greek way of life. So he said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious, but as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. So when we talk about that idol to an unknown God, this is not an uncommon thing in the Roman Empire. And a lot of it has to do, in fact, they've found artifacts, this one on the right. The inscription there in Greek has to do with this being the temple or the altar to the unknown God. You can see how it's curved at the top. That was to burn the sacrifices on. And the one on the left is a Roman idol to a Roman unknown God. But this is not even the one Paul is talking about here is not even the only one in the city of Athens. They were all over the place in the city of Athens. And the reason is because about 500 years before Paul came along, in 430 BC, there was a plague, okay? Scientists have even dug up DNA from some of the crypts. They found evidence of mass graves, so they know that there was a plague during this time. In fact, it came in 3 waves. In 430, kind of calmed down, hit again in 429, calmed down and they thought it was done and over, hit again in 426. So it came in 3 different waves. It killed 25 to 30% of the population. They estimate that is between 75,000 and 100,000 people. Okay, were killed by this plague. Scientists have checked the DNA, they've looked at all the evidence, and there's about 30 different ideas of what it could be, but the majority of them fall on the side that it was typhoid fever. Okay, the symptoms described by some of the writers of that day. Of course, in Athens, you had all these poets, and you had all these philosophers, and you had all these writers and these historians, and they're writing it all down. Some of them died in the plague, okay? But from the symptoms that they listed, most scientists believe it was probably typhoid fever. So because so many people were dying, and there seemed to be nothing to control it, it really gave a sense of spiritual anger and disappointment at the Greek gods. They felt let down by all these gods that they had, okay? And it caused the Greeks in Athens to turn to some really strange superstitions, okay? If these idols and gods couldn't protect us, let's find something else. And so in panic mode, people were doing a lot of things that they probably didn't do 10 years later. Kind of reminds me of COVID. Okay, we did a lot of things that we thought would help, and really they were superstitious, okay, because there's no science behind wearing a mask when viruses you can put 100 million of them between the threads of a mask. So, that kind of thing. So they came up with all these strange superstitions. And there was a poet, we talked about this one verse where he says, in him we live and move and have our being. Well, that was by a poet named Epimenides, and he was a Greek philosopher and, steeped in the Greek way of life. And he comes up with a plan to stop this plague. And his plan is this. It's dependent on the Greek gods, okay? Because really that's the only power or source of power they thought they had. So his plan was this, to take a huge flock of sheep, huge flock of sheep, both black sheep and white sheep, not sure why, but both black and white sheep, and take them to that spot known then as the Areopagus. It's right outside where the Parthenon is, okay? It's kind of on a little flat hill there. And at a given precise moment, they were to turn all of these sheep loose and let them run throughout the city, go wherever they wanted to go. Wherever a sheep got tired and decided to lie down, right on that very spot, you killed that sheep and you offered it as a sacrifice to the nearest idol to that sheep, okay? This way, without this many sheep and all of those idols, they could cover a lot of idols, and there were people assigned to follow certain sheep, and when they laid down, well, then it was to this idol, then you sacrifice it to that idol. This would tell them a couple of things. It showed them which idols were active in their minds, okay? And they got offered a sacrifice to that. Also, they felt like it allowed the gods to direct where the sheep would go. That was their belief. The gods were directing where the sheep would go. They could tell which ones are active, okay? But if a sheep laid down where there was no idol, okay, then they erected an idol. They erected a marker, okay, and they called it to the unknown God. We don't know what God's here in this spot, but this sheep laid down, and therefore there must be a God that we have missed. And so we're going to put an marker here to an unknown God. I know, it's laughable, I know. But this was what they were doing, okay? And so there were lots of those all over the city of Athens. Did it stop the plague? Of course not, okay? But it did erect a lot more idols in the city, now known as unknown God idols. So this unknown God idol where Paul is not the only one in the city of Athens, and it's certainly not the only one in the Roman Empire, because it was a common concept that there's a myriad of idols out there, there are a myriad of gods out there, and we just don't know who they all are, okay? And when we do figure out who one is, then we're going to erect something to them. I know. But they were serious about it, okay? It wasn't a joke to them, and it wasn't laughable, but I can see why it is to us, okay? So that's how this whole thing about an unknown God marker came about, where Paul is saying to them, I even found an altar with this inscription to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you, or this is who I'm going to proclaim to you. So Paul is really bold in what he's saying. And it's interesting that Paul comes into the city alone, okay? He doesn't have any group going ahead of him and setting things up and putting out flyers that he's going to be in Athens to speak or talk or anything like that. He doesn't have any support group of people around him, because you remember Lucas and Silas and Timothy and all that are still up in Macedonia. He told them to stay there. So he's by himself, and he doesn't have any of the things that he doesn't have any promoters, okay? He doesn't have anybody that's talking him up or anything. And so we saw at the beginning, he said he spoke in the marketplace to anybody who would listen. And eventually, he winds up preaching the gospel in front of the most powerful people in the city, simply because he was faithful to preach the gospel to whoever came across his path, to whoever he listened to whomever would listen to him, and eventually it got the attention of the important people. I don't know that was Paul's goal. I don't think so. I think Paul's goal was to preach the gospel to as many people as possible, and God used that to bring him into a very public arena with very powerful people. Mike?
Would he have known that he was looking at an idol where a sheep had gone?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know if that was common. You know, there wasn't much that Paul didn't know. He was very, very highly educated. I mean, he was an expert in the military stuff. He was an expert in farming. He was an expert in athletics, in theology, in Judaism, in the rabbinical law, Greek poetry. So probably, I don't know, Mike, he may have known the history of that. It was definitely history by then. It's almost 500 years before Paul. So, but it's still called the Plague of Athens. They think it happened because they were at war with Sparta at the time, and all of these people were coming and going, and they think that the plague actually started in Ethiopia, and they were using Ethiopian soldiers as part of that guard, and those guys brought the plague up to Greece, is what historians believe how it happened. So it was history even in Paul's day, so probably he would have known. So he takes that opportunity to talk to them. And when he talks to them, we looked at last week, he said, the one whom you worship without knowing, you don't even know who you're worshiping, him I proclaim to you, God. Right there, Paul has pretty much done away with all of the other Greek gods that there are, because he has basically said the one, him, God. And he goes on to say, he made the world and everything in it, since he's Lord of heaven and earth. He does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. We talked some of that stuff last time, but we're going to look at some of the things that specifically what he said, okay? One of the very first thing he says, you worshiping and you don't know him. You don't know him. You don't even know his name. How can you say you know him? You don't know him, and you admit that you don't know him. He's an unknown God, but you assume that there's one there. And he says, that's who I want to proclaim to you, the real, true, one God. And one of the things he's telling them, that as you go through this, he's telling them he is knowable. He's knowable. He is a knowable God. Then he goes on and he says, I proclaim him to you. He said, that's what I've been talking about. And Paul is letting them know everything he's been talking about in the marketplace. And he said, he made the world and everything in it. Now, what's interesting about that is that the Epicureans do not believe in a divine creation story. We talked about how they don't believe in the afterlife. Well, they also don't believe anything pre that. They believe that the earth has always been eternal and that it just happened. Sound familiar? There's nothing new under the sun, Solomon said, okay? But they don't believe in a divine, God-oriented creation story. Out of all those gods that they have, all those idols they have, they do not have a God of creation. Isn't that crazy? I would think that might be one of the first gods you come up with, but nope, they don't believe in that. The Stoics also don't have that kind of faith belief. They believe in a grand designer, but they don't believe the grand designer has anything to do with people. Once he designed it, it was done and over. There are people today who still believe that, oh, there must be a grand designer, but he's not involved in our lives. And they don't want him involved in their lives because then they might be accountable to somebody and there might be a moral standard. No different from the Stoics. They felt the same way. All right? Goes on and it says, he made everything in the world and everything in it. And he says, since he is Lord of heaven and earth. What is that saying about him? It says he is sovereign. He's over everything. You've got all this myriad of gods out here and these idols, street after street after street of them. And this God that I'm proclaiming to you is the only one. And he's over all that. He doesn't dwell. And it says he's Lord of heaven and earth, both, okay? So Paul is telling them there's nothing in the universe that he's not in charge of. You know, they had gods that were gods of the sky, gods of the sea, gods of the land, gods of the wheat, God of fertility, God of the grapes, God of whatever, you know? Every emotion you can think of, every physical thing you can think of. And he tells him, no, he's Lord over it all, over all heaven, and all earth, everything in the universe. That is the Greek way of saying everything that is, heaven and earth, all right? Doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. Well, that really would really get under their skin, since their whole city is filled with temples built with hands. Okay? They have fashioned all these things, and now they worship those things. And you're telling me he's not in any of them? But yet you're telling me he's the creator, and you're telling me he's sovereign, not only on heaven, but on earth, but yet he doesn't live in any of our temples? And then he goes on and says, and he's not worshiped with your hands. Wow. You can understand why these people wanted to know what Paul was talking about, because it's totally different than anything they've ever heard before. He says he's not worshiped with men's hands as if he needed anything. He doesn't need anything from us. But it is him who is the giver, not you worshipers. Worshiping idols always involved giving. You're giving a sacrifice, you're giving flowers, you're giving oil, you're giving lambs, you're giving whatever, money, whatever. You're giving your body in service to the temple. But it was all about the worshiper giving, okay? And Paul turns that on its head. He said, he doesn't need anything from you. He is the giver. He gives to everything life, breath, and he gives all things to people, okay? He's in charge of all that. He goes on and he attacks another one of their false beliefs. They have several false beliefs here. It says, he has made from one blood every nation of men who to dwell on all the face of the earth. He has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he's not far from each of us. So the very first part, he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth. Well, that is a huge slap in the face to the Greeks, who believed that their race, their culture was superior to every other race on the planet. Anyone besides them they called barbarians, because they said their speech sounded like bar, 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 bar. And so they came up with the word barbarian, okay? So that's anybody who wasn't Greek. They don't have mathematics, they don't have literature, they don't have the drama, they don't have the art that we have, they don't have the government that we have, and we are the premier race of people on the planet. And their belief system was that their humanity arose from the wonderful soil of the Greek land. And that's how people were, that's their creation story, okay? People rose up from this wonderful story, this wonderful soil of this Greek land. And here Paul is saying, from one man, every other human being on the planet was created. Well, what would that do to their theory? What would it mean? All these people you're calling barbarians are what? Equal? Worse than equal, they're relatives. Yeah, you're related to these people that you think you are so superior to, okay? All of these people, he's over everybody, and from one man, he created all of them. And they don't get any of that. And then he goes on and tells them, you're here because you're here where you are with the land that you have. And remember, their empire had been great just a couple 100 years before this. He says, and God determined the pre-appointed times for your country's existence, every nation's existence, and the boundaries for how much land you're going to have. It was God who determined that. This God that you're calling unknown, he is the one who has done all these things, created everything, gave life to everything, raised up humanity from one man, okay? All of this is absolutely opposite of what the Greeks believe, okay? So he talks about the fact that he determined their pre-appointed times, meaning he's sovereign, but not only that, it also means he's outside of time and space. He's above all that. He is an eternal being, an eternal God. Well, you remember the Epicureans and the Stoics. They don't, either one, really believe in eternal afterlife. The Epicureans say that once you're dead, you're dead. The Stoics say, well, once you're dead, there's a cosmic recycling that goes on every so often, and you'll probably appear again, but you won't know it. But their whole idea for both groups is that when you die, you won't suffer because you won't know you're dead. That you cease to exist, therefore you won't know you're dead. So there's no suffering, and so if there's no suffering and there's no afterlife, then the Epicureans say that there's no reason not to enjoy everything you can, and the Stoics say, well, then there's no reason not to be as virtuous as you can, be as moral as you can. Two sides of the same kind of false teaching. All right? So he is eternal, and they don't really believe in that. This stay up there? Okay. He's eternal. And then he says, but, yeah, he's eternal, but he's not far from you. How can he be eternal? How can he be out there and yet be here? It goes back to what he said about he doesn't dwell in temples and he's not made with hands. So what is that saying? He's above time and space and he's out there, but he's also close to you. What's it tell you about God? He's omnipresent. Yes. And he is a spirit. So he's not an idol. He's not a piece of rock. He's not concrete. He's not a carving like we saw up there. He's none of those things. In fact, he's a spirit, because that's the only way you can be all those places and yet not be far from us. And in him, we live and move and have our being, and we talked about that as being what was a line from the poets, and also that we are his offspring. He goes on and he says, therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone. He says, we're thinking too small. If we are his offspring, we're more human than these things you've created. We're more divine. We're more godly. We're alive. We breathe. We have a soul. We can reproduce. That statue's never going to do any of that. So he says, it's crazy that you think that the divine nature can be enclosed in just a hunk of silver, gold, or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising, your own idea. God is way above our ideas. And then this next part is really kind of the crux of the matter. Paul basically tells him, he says, truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked. The root word for ignorance is unknown. These times that you didn't know any better, these times of unknowing, God overlooked. This is the only time the word overlooked appears in the New Testament. And it doesn't mean that God turned his head. It doesn't mean that he said, okay, those sins don't count. It doesn't mean any of that. It basically means that God did not actively interfere with a special judgment for those people at that time. This is all part of the fact that God has been very, very, very patient in dealing with people's convoluted ideas about who gods are, about their idolatry, and about all of those things. Even in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, it says, he who sins will die, okay? And it says that each person will pay for their sins in the Old Testament. Sin has consequences. We've always seen that in the Old Testament as well. This is not a statement in the New Testament saying, well, all those guys got to buy, and God said, well, just go do what you want to do. No. God has never approved of evil. He gave, as the Old Testament also tells us, he gave light to every man's soul. Meaning every human being has a conscience, okay? We know right from wrong, and moral cultures teach right from wrong, even if they aren't a Christian nation. So there we go. He says, these times God overlooked out of God's patience, all right? So if you think about this, we had creation, and if you use the timetable in the Bible, 1,650 years later, we have the flood, where God punishes the people for the very same things that the Greeks are doing now. Being self-centered, being murderous, being prideful, building their own temples and idols and ziggurats, not having any time for God, not worshiping, all of those things. 1,650 years. He drowned the whole world except for Noah. That, from this time in Greece, when Paul's talking, that's 2,500 years ago. So he's telling them 2,500 years ago, okay, God exacted some judgment. Now he's been patient for the next 2,500 years. And he says, but now, 2,500 years later, he commands all men everywhere to repent. Why? Because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world. God didn't flood the world in a vacuum. He came to Noah, and he told Noah that there will be 120 years, and I am going to destroy the world. He set a day. He set a day. On this date, 120 years from now, I'm going to destroy the world. What did Noah do all during that 120 years? What does Scripture say that he did? Not what we want to guess, but what did it say he did? He built an ark. It says he preached. He preached God for 120 years. He preached during that time. 7 days before the rain came, he set the day again. He told Noah, get your family, get in the boat, because in 7 days it's going to start. He set a date. 120 years later, set a date. 7 days from now, it's going to start. And it did. Okay? So here, Paul is telling these Greeks that don't have the benefit of the Jewish Old Testament, telling them God has been patient with your lack of knowledge of the real God for all this time, but now he's appointed another day. He has appointed a day on which he will judge the world. There is a day he has set, and it's coming, and the purpose is to judge the world. He's going to judge the world in righteousness, meaning that it'll be totally fair, all right? There will be no special privileges for special people. The rich people won't be better than the poor. The masters won't be better than the slaves. Greeks won't be better than the barbarians, okay? He says he will judge the world in righteousness by the man, all right, whom he has ordained. Ordained, he's set apart. We know that this is Jesus Christ, and he's going to drop that bombshell on him here real quick, all right? He says God has set a day, and he's set a judge, and that is going to happen. And now God is no longer going to at that point, God will no longer be patient with your ignorance of this unknown God. He will not be patient with that. He will judge the world. And then he says, and he has given assurance. He has given us proof of this to everyone by raising this man from the dead. Now, would they have heard about this resurrection of Jesus from the dead? Of course they would. The whole world's talking about it, right? And all these Jews are going everywhere and spreading that word, and they're all talking about it and everything. And Athens is a huge trading center with people coming by ship and by trade route, back and forth all over the place. And it's a place where all they do is what? Talk about and listen to the latest new thing, the latest new ideas. They've talked about this, whether or not the Jews are right that they had a man rise from the dead. If they hadn't, that's almost impossible to think that they hadn't. That would have to have been them living like storks with their heads in the sand or something, but that's not what the Greeks did. They were well known for dissecting every new idea that came along. And so Paul very flatly tells them, God proved this is all true because he raised this man from the dead. All right? That's the tipping point. That's the boil-over point. Now, there's not a persecution here, but they're done with Paul, the majority of them. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. The Epicureans, the Stoics, more than likely, the Cynics, all of those, they would have mocked and said, we know better than that. We've taught for years and been taught for years that there is no afterlife, that there was no creation story, that people never come back from the dead. Once you're dead forever. And even the Stoics who say, well, there might be some recycling, you don't know about it, and you're not going to come back the same person, blah, blah. This is craziness. They mocked. While others said, well, maybe we need to listen to you some more. They were the people who were a little curious, but they weren't curious enough to continue the conversation right then. So we saw last time when we talked about this, Paul departed from among them. However, some men joined him and believed. The word joined, we said, was glued. Some people glued themselves to Paul, followed him everywhere he went. And it says, among them was Dionysius, the Areopagite, who was one of the judges of the Areopagus court. So he grabbed one of the highest people in the land, then becomes a believer, and then a woman named Damaris, and we know nothing about her. All right? So here's Paul's three main points to the people of Athens. Number one, God is knowable. There's no such thing as an unknown God. And this is the God that I proclaim to you, he says, and you can know who he is. He's near to us. He hears us. He's right here, all right? The second message is God is eternal, and he's a spirit. He tells them that by talking about the fact he's the creator, and he's the sustainer. He made everything, and he gives everything life and breath and being, and he continues that sustaining. And it says he's over all heaven and earth. So he is sovereign over everything. And the third thing, God has spoken. In previous times, God overlooked what was going on, but God has said there is coming a day for judgment. God has spoken. All of these things are anti-Greek religion, okay? None of these things fit into their theology. So, what else do I have in here? Oh, I had some stuff in here about what the Epicureans didn't believe in resurrection. They have this one thing called the symmetry argument. They said, well, you don't fear the time before you were born. Are any of you afraid of the time before you were born? Yeah, because we don't know anything about it. So if you're not afraid of what happens before your birth, then you should have no fear what happens after your birth, because it's just endless time like it was before. Then they have a non-existence rule. When you're alive, death's not here yet. When death gets here, you don't exist anymore, so you don't have to worry about it. You don't experience. So all of that leads to what they determined was peace of mind, which, if you think about it, that's what every person on the planet's looking for, peace of mind. If you realize there's no afterlife, then people lose their fear of dying, and they can focus on living a calm, happy life right now in the moment. And that was their goal. The Stoics practiced this thing called memento mori, which basically said, just remember, you will die. Well, that's true. But they said it with the point being, always remember that you will die, therefore enjoy the moment that you have, okay? Enjoy the present moment. Because life is short and final, living virtuously right now is what matters most and the best you can do, and then they had that cyclic cosmos thing. So when we see Jesus as the God of the resurrection, we know that Jesus came out as God out of the grave for two purposes: to save any of those who will repent and embrace him as Savior. That's what Paul said. Now he demands that you repent and believe, because the judgment day is coming. So two reasons he comes out of the grave: to save those who repent and embrace him as Savior, and to judge those who don't. And that's what Paul's saying there. The judgment is coming. All right? So that sums up the end of chapter 17. Stuff I didn't get to go over last week. All right. Now, chapter 18. Paul in Corinth. All right? So, Paul's going to leave Athens. Actually, there's no persecution there, but there's no big revival, and there's not a whole bunch of people that follow him there. We don't see that he established a church there, because there's no letter to the church at Athens. We saw Dionysius and Damaris mentioned. Surely there were more Christians who came from that, but the fruit of that endeavor doesn't seem to be overwhelming. All right? So Paul leaves Athens, which you can see there over toward the right, and goes to Corinth. All right? See that little strip of land in between there? It's called an isthmus. It connects these two larger bodies of land. Right where you see the dot, I can't get that close. Right where you see the dot for Corinth, right there, that little piece of land, that's 5 miles across. That's all it is, really about 4 3/4 miles across there. From Athens to Corinth, obviously the map's not to scale. From Athens to Corinth, it's about 53 miles if you walk. So it's about a 2 to 3 day journey. But some people leave Athens on the east side and go by boat over to Corinth. You got to walk to the port, and then you got to walk from the port you come to outside of Corinth until you get to the city. So all in all, it's about 3/4 of a day. Okay, so most people would probably have chosen to walk, even though it's 2 to 3 days, because it would be a lot cheaper, and there's no chance of shipwreck, okay, which that's a big deal in that bay, especially when wintertime comes. So Corinth couldn't be more different than Athens, okay? Athens is focuses on the mind and the brain and the intellect and beauty, and Corinth focuses on the physical body and the grossest kind of pleasures you can imagine. All right? Because of Corinth's location there on that little isthmus, it not only, let me go back to that a second, not only is it a trade route from east to west, but it's also a trade route from north to south, with ships coming all the way from the Roman Empire, all the way up, down through that bay to Corinth, okay? Now, they won't come around here. This is a 200-mile shortcut to come to Corinth and then cross that isthmus and get back in the water. Around this bottom part here, hundreds, literally thousands of tiny little islands all sticking up out of, the majority of them don't have anybody living on them because they're too tiny. Rocky and dangerous. The winds along the Mediterranean are at storm level most of the time. So most sailors, would, if given the option, came to Corinth and crossed that way. They would load their wares on the backs of slaves and have them carry them the 4.5, 5 miles across land and put them on another boat, or put them in carts if they were a little wealthier. Really wealthy merchants would have a ship on either side. They'd have a ship coming this way with goods. They would have a ship coming this way with goods from the Far East, okay? And then they would put the boat, or they would put the goods on big flatbed things, and they would roll them on logs 4.5 miles. That's a lot of logs, but they would roll them, again, using slaves or poorly paid people to do all that pushing. If the boats weren't huge, they'd roll the boats across, all right? So so what you see there is you have all points of the world, okay, can come right to Corinth. It's that busy a place. Most historians call it a mobile culture because nobody really lives there, okay? Very few people stay there. It's influenced by all the people who are coming and going all the time, okay? You might season there for a while your ships are being refitted or whatever. You might be there 3 or 4 months, and then you're gone again. And obviously there are some local folks there who provide goods and services, but it's not like a fixed, established city with a history of government and people that goes back and back and back. It's just too mobile, okay? The bottom part of that, you see, it's called Achaia, and that's just this peninsula of Greece and all the islands, all right? You see that word a lot in the New Testament letters, and it just means this bottom half of Greece that's all broken up. Macedonia is the name for the solid body of Greece that goes all the way up to Asia, what we would call Asia Minor, okay? All right. Corinth, besides being a sailor's dream place. It was, and a shipping center. It was also this large temple down here in the plain level. You can see, oh no, you can't see. This thing likes to just crawl out of here. All right, down in front, this would be like streets, and each one of those squares is like a building that would have come up from there. It's the foundations of buildings and these streets along here. And what you see up there, which is all lit at night, which is really beautiful, but it's called the Temple of Apollos, all right? And that's the Greek temple for the Greek god Apollos. And if you look up on that mountain thing there is called an acropolis. It's a big outcropping of rock. And if you look at the very, very top, you can see it looks jagged at the top. That's because, I think you can see it better in this one maybe. At the very, very top, it's called Acrocorinth, or the Corinth Acropolis up there. And up there it is the temple to Aphrodite. All right, and a closer picture of that. This is what it looks like today. You can go march all around it once you get up there. It's quite the trek to get up there. There are no guardrails anywhere. There are some places where it's a goat path. You're really hugging the wall to get around there, but you can get all the way through there. And they've excavated all this, and this is the temple to Aphrodite, which is the temple of love and fertility. And it housed over 1,000 temple priestesses and prostitutes, okay? Once the sun went down, they came down into the city, and all of the sailors and everybody who was there, all of the travelers and all of that, they did what prostitutes do. And the money went back to the temple to supply the priest and all that. And there were male and female prostitutes, by the way. It wasn't just a feminine thing, okay? So if you compare this kind of a city to Athens, it couldn't be more opposite. Of the two, I would expect that Paul, with his upbringing as a Pharisee and his high education level and everything else, he would be more at home in Athens than he would be in Corinth, okay? Corinth was a kind of rip-roaring town where anything was allowed. Anything was allowed. It was also well known for drunken brawls, where only the strong survived in Corinth when they were there. Because it was such a mobile city, people were away from any restrictions they might have at home. They were away from any inhibitions. Kind of like whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You could really kind of say that about Corinth. Whatever happens to Corinth stays in Corinth. And so it kind of was like it let off all their moral restrictions when they were there. But the sad thing is, this was just not just the lower class working people. It wasn't just the slaves. It wasn't just the sailors. This was the upper crust people as well. This is how they lived their life. The entire city was pretty debased. All these caravans that were coming through, every entertainment that satisfied your lust was there. In fact, so much so that the word Corinth became a synonym for immorality. Even in England in the Victorian era, a Corinthian is another word for a female prostitute. Okay, to Corinthianize was to be someone who was drunken and debauched all the time, and that's really what the word kind of came to mean. So their reputation followed them for centuries. Okay. Another thing they're known for, since that little piece of land is called an isthmus because it hooks two bigger pieces of land together. They were the home of the Isthmian Games, second only to the Olympic Games at that time, okay? So a lot of sports activities and events that went on there, and you know what kind of stuff goes on in the cities where the Olympics come to now. It's one of the biggest human trafficking events of the year, or of the 4 years. So just very, very vile. The Greeks, in contrast, they put on a lot of stage plays, and they did a lot of art and a lot of things. In fact, whenever they would have a play for anybody who was a Corinthian in the play, he was always drunk, okay? And a lot of times the drunk in the play's name was Corinth, which just tells you what it's about. All right, so this is where Paul now has come, from the educational and social finesse of Athens to Vegas on its worst day, I think. That's where he's at now. So chapter 18, let's look at that. Paul was a Roman citizen, but he was raised as a Jew and as a Pharisee. So his moral code was way up here, yeah, but he was Roman. All right, so chapter 18, it says, after these things, meaning after getting done with Athens, with Damaris and Dionysius or whatever, and all of that, it says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus. Pontus is a town up north of the Baltic Sea area, up near the Asia Minor, up that area. But he had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. Okay, this is Emperor Claudius, which is one of the details that Luke gives us, which is nice because it enables us to put dates to these things. So we know what time that was, so what the time frame was. Claudius had decided that he was tired of the Jews. And remember that at this point in time, more Jews lived outside of Palestine than lived in Palestine, and there was a huge Jewish population in Rome. But Claudius decided he didn't like the Jews anymore, and he commanded they all had to leave. And so they had left, and it turns out they wind up, whether they were passing through or what, who knows, but Aquila and Priscilla, and he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. The word tent makers could be that he actually made tents. I know we see in Arabian Nights and stuff, most of the tents are red and white striped or blue and white striped and made of wonderful fabric or whatever. But truly in that day, most tents were made of leather. Can you guess why? Weatherproof, right? And the word tent maker can really be interpreted leather worker. So it might not be that the only thing they did was make tents. They may have made anything out of leather that you can think of, bridles for animals or whatever, pouches and things like that. And so since they were both of the same trade, they worked together, and this is one of the ways we see when Paul is in pain and he's miserable and he's lonely and he's in a place where you can't really even have a conversation with anybody without it turning filthy, and he's not about that. God comforts him, sends him another Jewish family who have the same trade as him, he can work with, have some fellowship with, talk world events with, what's going on in Rome, why did Claudius throw you out, what have you been doing, what do you mean you were in Thessalonica, and blah, blah, blah. So finally, it's like God sends Priscilla and Aquila to the right place at the right time, to the right person, in order to minister to Paul. Now we know Paul ministers to them. These two people become very, very good friends with Paul, and we're going to see they help him with the ministry throughout the letters. You'll see their names. All right. So what's he do? It says he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. What? There are synagogues in Corinth. You wouldn't expect that. But there are churches in Las Vegas. And there's missionaries that work in Las Vegas, believe it or not. So he reasoned. That means he debated back and forth, and he'd held question and answer sessions with them in the synagogue every Sabbath. And he persuaded both Jews and Greeks. This is a really cosmopolitan group of people here. They're coming from all over. So he's able to talk to Jews, and he's able to talk to Greeks who are God-fearers, and he's able to talk to Greeks who are not God-fearers. But he's persuading both of them. And then it says, good news, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia. So we saw Macedonia up there. That's where Thessalonica, Philippi, and Berea, where he has to leave all those places and come down to Athens. They came from the north. Paul was compelled by the Spirit. He's hearing from God again, and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. So it kind of seems like Paul has been given some time out to nurse his wounds, think about everything that's happened and everything that's gone on, and God has given him kind of a respite, kind of a time to regather. And then he sends him Priscilla and Aquila to comfort him and strengthen him. And then Timothy and Silas show up, and Paul is ready to go back to work again. Okay? So he's in a city with a synagogue where he can preach the gospel, and it says he's compelled by the Spirit, so he testifies to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the Messiah, and that's what he's trying to convince them of. But then again, every synagogue Paul preaches that in, he winds up with opposition. When they opposed him and blasphemed, notice they're probably accusing Paul of blaspheming, but they're actually the ones who are blaspheming, because they're saying there's no way Jesus could be the Christ. There's no way he could be the Messiah. When that got to a peak level, Paul finally says, enough. He shook his garments and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Shaking his garments is what Jesus had told the disciples to do. If you go into towns and they won't hear you, shake the sand off your sandals and off your garments, and Jesus says, as a judgment against them. So this is not just a, I'm in a tiff and I'm done with you. This is a judgment from God. Right after that, Jesus says, whatever you bind in heaven will be bound in heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So he says, when you pass a judgment on them, God's going to honor it. If they refuse to listen to the story of the gospel, shake your garments off and move on. And that comes from a Jewish tradition of when they came out of Gentile land, or especially Samaritan land, they believed that their land was defiled, okay, unclean. That's why Paul says, I am clean. They felt like the land and the soil was unclean, and they didn't want to bring any of it back onto Jewish land, so they shook it off and before they stepped foot back into Jewish territory. And so Jesus used that cultural custom to use it as a judgment. If that's the case, judge them. And so that's exactly what Paul does here. And notice the judgment. Your blood be on your own heads. Well, that sounds pretty serious. Your blood be on your own heads. Paul says, I'm not responsible for the fact that you're going to be in eternal hell. That responsibility falls on you. I've done everything I can do. And he says, I am clean. I'm shaking the dirt off of you, and I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. That would be a slap to the Jews as well, right? But remember when Jesus called Paul, he told him, you are going to be my ambassador you are going to be my apostle to the Gentiles. But he told him, go to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles. And here we see a turning point. His ministry is going to be mostly to Gentiles after this. We see in later letters where Paul grieves over the fact that his Jewish brethren do not come to believe that Christ is the Messiah. In fact, he says, were it possible, I would take their punishment to see my nation saved. He has such a heart for his own people, but they don't. God has kind of a sense of humor here. We'll go over this a little deeper next week, but he says, as he departed from there, the synagogue, that's what the there is. As he departed from the synagogue, he entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Don't you love it? This guy named Justus worshiped God. Paul goes into his house, convinces him of the gospel message. It says, then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, okay? He's not a king. He's not a ruler in that sense. He's not a governor. He's not a dictator. He's the one who takes care of the synagogue, takes care of the scrolls, takes care of getting the special people each to speak each Sabbath day, trade scrolls out with other synagogues and all that. It is an honorable position, and it's kind of like a person that you know can be trusted with the most valuable things that the community has. You wouldn't want an embezzler in there who would sell the scrolls and say they were lost. So it's somebody honorable, but it's considered an important high-level position. So Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Now, what do you think the Corinthians were? Jews? No. Gentiles from all over. And no telling what kind they were. Most Corinthians weren't anything to write home about. But isn't that amazing? When he decides to be done with the synagogue and only go to the Gentiles, God gives him a space to be right next door to the synagogue to preach the gospel. I wonder if that's how Crispus came to understand the gospel, because he could constantly hear Paul day after day after day talking about the gospel message to the people in this guy's house named Justus. Crispus, as the ruler, would have been in the synagogue most days of the week doing stuff, So he would have an opportunity to hear Paul more often than just your normal people. All right, we'll start there next week in 18, right around verse 9. That's where we'll start next week.
I wonder how many of the Corinthians, how do you say that word,
Corinthians.
went back to over there, the ones that was hearing, believing, and baptized, went back over there and tried to get more people.
Sure. That's a wonderful thing about the city of Corinth. It was so mobile. These people who believed and got baptized, they're going to spread like flies.